Hey, podcast listeners, it's a new year and there's all kinds of new things going on, but I am still offering support. For those of you who are in the LGBTQ community, maybe you are in the closet, maybe you're a parent of a queer kid and you're just somebody who needs some spiritual support. Right now, you can go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. For as little as $1 a month, you can get support, and at $4.99 a month, you can get direct message access and just get spiritual care from me. Go to patreon.com/Joanna Whaley. If you're somebody who would like to gift memberships, you can go to joannawhaley.com/donate, and you can gift memberships to people. Maybe a financial burden is a barrier for them. Another thing that's coming up is right now I am booking dates for my 2025 Pride Month tour called the Faith in Pride Tour. You can go to joannawhaley.com/contact and reach out there. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another week of the Joanna Whaley podcast. I'm so happy you're here. Welcome. As you heard in the commercial here today, yes, I'm getting ready this Pride Month 2025 to do another tour. As this last year played out and I was in my final semester of seminary, I thought to myself, am I going to do this again? Am I going to do music again? Am I going to tour again? And I was leaning towards no, but then I've just been getting more and more feedback and questions of people hoping to catch a concert. And so get ready for that. If you are a pastor, if you are somebody who's connected to a church and would love to do a pride service or have a trans woman come and do some music and storytelling at your church, reach out wherever you're listening to this. Friends, welcome. We are recording this podcast the day before January 6th. Yes, it's January 5th when I'm recording this. And I don't know about you, but I remember the exact place I was when I watched the January 6th insurrection happen at the United States Capitol. Again, my name is Joanna Whaley. I'm a former evangelical pastor and I'm a transgender woman. And yes, those two identities were absolutely and have absolutely been a total chaotic experience in my life. And for many of us in the LGBTQ community, we have been watching what is coming. We've been watching what's coming with our new president-elect with a little bit of skepticism. There's a lot of fear out there as well. But what I want to say is 4 years ago, I was still in the closet as a trans woman, and I was at home, doing the dishes. I was a pastor at this time, okay? So I'm doing the dishes. I was cleaning all these pots and pans from lunch that we had. And I remember watching on TV, I'm like, I don't know why, I'm just going to turn this thing on. I'm going to turn on the TV. I'm going to watch, I just turn on NBC. All I remember was Lester Holt. And I'm sitting there and I remember they're like, this could be a historic day, it could be nothing. And I remember when all of a sudden you heard Lester Holt break in and kind of just have a moment was that we need to interrupt and go to the Capitol, where people began storming into the United States Capitol to try and interrupt the government proceeding of certifying the election of President Joe Biden. And I just never will forget it. And I forget what the instance was. I remember I was home alone. I was doing the dishes, waiting for, the family to come home. And I just remember texting, the person I was married to at the time saying, hey, are you hearing and seeing what's going on right now? And I just remember that moment. That's like, this is one of those moments, these moments I'm never going to forget. I will never forget the moment when I watched in horror over the next few hours, the insurrection at the United States Capitol. We have this whole thing going on, right? We had that whole thing going on. And right now, as we stand at the 4-year anniversary of this thing happening, the January 6th insurrection, I, as a queer person, and just as a person in general, I'm not looking at a hopeful America ahead. I'm not looking at a country that was promised to me as a young kid when I went to school. In history class, we were told that, this was a land of promise and of freedom and whatnot. As a queer American, I'm looking at the next 4 years with a little bit of horror. I'm looking at the next 4 years just waiting for the chaos to return. And here's what I can't get over, is that America wanted a king, and we got him. Christians were begging for a king, and they got him. I started doing this thing recently. I kind of stepped out of the denominational world, and I stepped into my own, I've stepped into the more non-denominational church setting as a queer person. Yes, I'm attending now a fully affirming non-denominational church. They do exist out there. But here's the thing. The denominational church has this thing called a lectionary, okay? And the lectionary is this every week for, years and years and years, they have a week by week Bible passage that the pastors preach from, right? I determined that I was going to begin to create my own sort of queer lectionary. And yes, I am potentially going to work on this and publish it on my website at joannawhaley.com. So you're going to have a queer lectionary coming at you soon. But I picked a passage today that really sits with where we are, especially here on the week of January 6th. And it's 1 Samuel 8. Verses 4 through 19. Now, if you're listening to my show and you are not religious, you are not somebody who comes from the Christian faith, just listen to what I'm saying and try to, translate it to wherever you're at. But this is a passage in the Christian or the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew text, that discusses this moment where the Israelites became a free people, but they wanted a king. They started asking Samuel, this prophet, for a king. And I'm going to read, I don't normally do this on my show, but I'm going to read a pretty long section of passage for you. Yes, I'm going to read, yes, I'm a trans woman, and I'm going to read the Bible. It's actually possible. It happens. So, I'm going to read it. 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 15. It says this. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old," saying this to Samuel, "you're old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us, like other nations." But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me, serving other gods. So also they are doing unto you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." Verse 10 says, So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots. And he will appoint himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and the equipments for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers." Talk about patriarchy. "He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers. If I had to give a title for today, it would be this. Don't be surprised. If you come from like a religious churchy background, I would be the pastor on stage right now saying, the title of my passage of this sermon is, don't be surprised. What do I mean by this? If you look at this passage and you look at where we are and where I'm recording this podcast, it is in America. I live in America, the United States of America. And right now, many who call Jesus Lord, who claim Christianity, have fallen for a king, as in Samuel, as in this passage, have fallen for someone who has promised them strongman leadership just like this. So, the title of today's episode is Don't Be Surprised. The first thing I want you to walk away with today is don't be surprised when the Christian faith becomes militant rather than loving. We've already seen it. Those of us in the queer community have absolutely seen it. We have seen a Christian faith become militant, have become defensive of its own ideas. We have watched a Christian faith become so against the queer person, so against the minority, so against the other, that it has gone far away from its loving nature into one of control, into one of coercion, into one of power. Don't be surprised when that Christian faith becomes militarized. I watched as a pastor in my last year of pastoring in a congregation. I remember there were weekends that I stood on stage. And this might be hard for maybe some people listening to my show or watching the show who I pastored in this time. There was a stretch of time, it was like a year, that every week I stood up on stage, I would sing or I would speak in front of thousands of people in our church, and I was angry at every single person in the congregation. I was just angry at the church. I was angry at the people who stood in the front rows with their hands raised, eyes closed, singing and worshiping with all their hearts, while all the while being awful human beings to others online all week long. I was especially true to those who were in the queer community. Absolutely true. I watched people with their Pick Jesus t-shirts and their cheesy Christian, necklaces and things like that, who were just menaces online. Were just menaces and terrible to anyone who represented anything other than heteronormativity. I was especially attuned to it because I was a closeted trans person and I was getting ready to come out myself. But there I was, standing on stage, wondering, what happened to you? Why aren't you loving anymore? What happened to you who used to embrace the lost, that you called the lost, but now you scream at them for being lost? The very people you tried to reach are the very people you're belittling every day online. The Christian faith has strayed so far from its loving roots and has become militarized. Like verse 11, it says, the king will reign over you, and he will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen. And many people say, oh, that's great. My kids are going to be appointed to places of power. But what you don't realize is that being in a chariot and being a horseman in this time, in biblical times, it may have felt like power, but it was a path to destruction. It was the front lines of death. It was saying, look, put on this awesome armor. You're going to be respected in your hometown, but I'm going to make you run into battle and you're going to lose your children. How many of us have lost our family members to these crazy MAGA movements? I loved when Governor Tim Walz, who was a vice presidential candidate in this last election, he said, we're tired of these weird arguments at our family parties because people who were once loving have just become weird. Like, this is what's happened, like, at the expense of trying to connect and hitch their trailers to this king that many have wanted. They have become frontline workers for this pointless battle that has done nothing but lose loved ones in meaningless fights and militant ideas. You may think that you're making some kind of cause or movement in the kingdom by fighting against the queer person or the minority. But what's actually happening is that you are dying to those who love you. And we want you back. They want you back. The second thing I want you to hear today is, don't be surprised when the church serves its leaders rather than God. What do I mean by this? Many in the Christian faith right now are falling for this strong man, this king. They've been begging for a king. They got this king. And now what happens is that I worked for a youth pastor. His name is Adam, one of my dearest friends. And he used to have this this leadership principle called unedited. And it was like your students or the people who follow you will live the unedited version of your life. And I always used to love it. We had really funny ways of communicating that when I worked with him and was in leadership. But, when pastors and church people begin to see that their king Trump, the orange Jesus, as Liz Cheney called him, becomes more and more emboldened and gets into power, those who fight for him, especially from pulpits, become really drawn into his example. And this king that everyone has elected, this president-elect or president by maybe the time you're listening to this, is really wanting to serve himself. And so what's going to happen, and what we already see in many churches today, is pastors serving themselves. Churches serving the needs of a pastor rather than the pastor in the church serving the community. How do I know this? I've worked in many churches where the pastor just sits in the green room, collects the money, and leaves and never talks to anyone in the congregation, doesn't take appointments, doesn't pastor, just is the personality that carries the church. I heard a pastor once say that I worked with say, this church takes on my personality. I was like, really? Like, shouldn't this place reflect God? Like, shouldn't that be what this place reflects? But church pastors and leaders get emboldened by strongman leaders that they love, and they live the unedited version of that. And there's not news cameras pointed on all these pastors who are abusing their power and abusing their influence and using the church to serve themselves. Verse 12 says, he's going to appoint himself commanders, right? To plow his ground and reap his harvest. Pastors, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when the church serves itself and its leaders before the community and itself. Don't be surprised, because many are going to till up this ground, right? They're going to work on that. They're going to build and work this ground all to please themselves and to build up their own riches. So don't be surprised when the church serves itself, its own leaders rather than God. The other thing I want you to walk away with today is, don't be surprised when you give and the church just takes from you. One of the key examples we have in our modern culture, especially with this King Trump that everyone has tried to elect, is People have given so much to this man. They have given so much money. They have given so much ideological energy. And all this man does is continue to take from those people and take advantage of those people. And the church is following suit. The church has been doing this. Don't be surprised when you give your all to an organization and it doesn't care about you at all afterwards. Don't be surprised when you give and there's no recognition, there's no payoff. Don't be surprised when you give everything and all you hear is, you're getting rich in heaven. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if you give your whole life to the church and you heed their counsel of being honest and authentic, and you come out because you're in love with someone of the same gender or you are a trans person. Don't be surprised when the church kicks you out and calls you crazy and tells everyone around that you are deceived. I have watched churches who key leaders have come out in their congregations and decided that the proper avenue would be to bring that person up on stage and shame them in front of entire hundreds of people. Don't be surprised. There's this thing called systems theory. I'm learning a lot of it right now in my postgraduate programs. But really the idea is that the church or the systems that you are a part of are designed to protect themselves. They're not designed for celebrating humanity. They're designed for protecting themselves at all costs. And they're designed to take the best and leave the scraps, right? Verse 14 of that passage in 1 Samuel, it says, he will take the best of your fields. Right now, all over, because people have watched their leader take the best out of people and leave them with the scraps. There are so many out there who have fallen and have broken hearts because of how the church has treated them. And how so many have walked through the church telling them they're safe, that they belong, and that they're family. But when rubber meets the road, it's only interested in itself. This is a very broad idea, right? This is a broad idea, but it really speaks to the queer experience, especially right now. For those of us who identify as LGBTQIA+, we have been watching over the last many years the church become more and more militant against our community. We have watched good, well-meaning people turn into absolute jerks to anyone who they disagree with. We have watched our loved ones. We have watched those who walked with us in some of our darkest moments. We have watched them turn into absolute tyrants, all because of their interpretation of faith. We have watched over the years, and we're continuing to watch, a whole generation of queer people be cast aside because it serves the leader. Because the leader can't even sniff of being welcoming, or the money will dry up. you think I'm crazy? I've talked to pastor after pastor who wishes they could just come out because they're either queer or they want to be an accepting church, but they have to fall in line or lose everything. So we've watched leaders time and time again use the queer person as the means to serve itself financially. I had a church once when I lived in an apartment, a church right down the street, sent out this, and I had built months and months building trust with my neighbors. And they sent out this really transphobic postcard. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to read that my neighbors were all reading this on that day. I wish I could just have gone into every mailbox, committed mail fraud, and taken them all. I reached out to that church and I said, "You made me feel unsafe in my own community." And you know what the church's response was? "We don't care. We're speaking the truth to you." So don't be surprised, friends. Don't be surprised when the church lets you down. Don't be surprised when the church that you went to or the church that you've always attended doesn't accept you when you're queer. Don't be surprised when the pastors won't back you when they told you that you were part of their family. That's a whole podcast in its own. But don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when you give and you give. Even if you've invested decades inside of a church, and if you're honest about who you are or who you love, that the organization gives up on you. Because the system is going to try to protect itself, and money talks. And your queerness doesn't play in a lot of churches. To my queer friends out there who have tried to hold on to faith, and you've been told you can't, let me be one voice today telling you you can. Let me be the one voice wherever you're listening to this. For me, it used to be in the car and mowing the lawn. It was the only time I could listen to queer affirming things. You who are driving to work and you're in the closet and you're afraid of coming out. You're not a problem for God. You're not. You might be a problem for the systems of this world. You might be a problem for your church, but you are not a problem for God. As we are on the eve of this January 6th thing, and we are getting ready for MAGA chaos again in America, you're not a problem for God. You might be for your government, but don't be surprised. Don't be surprised. Be ready. Be ready. The name of this series this month is called Inauguration Agitation. Because there's many of us that are fearful right now. Many of us are afraid of what is to come. We are afraid that who we are, who we love, who loves us is in danger.